Hi, my name is Lisa Pearl, and I'm going to be telling you, or at least I'll be telling EyeLands Lab on November 4th, about a new way to identify if variation in children's input is developmentally meaningful, and taking a look at syntactic knowledge across socio-economic status. And so, one thing that we know is that there's lots of variation in children's input, right? How often people speak to them, who speaks to them, what kinds of things they talk about, what structures they use. There's lots of different types of variation. And what I'm interested in identifying is when that variation is developmentally meaningful, in particular that the variation that impacts language development in some measurable way, therefore is developmentally meaningful. And so developmentally meaningful input deficits can then lead to language delays, right? If the input is deficient in some way that impacts development, then language might be delayed or at least different in terms of the outcome that we see. And so, in particular, if there's an input-based language delay, and we know what the crucial input deficit is, then we can better intervene and fix that deficit, right? So if you're thinking about this in terms of interventions, things you can do to help, you have a better chance of creating ones that are impactful, that might actually work. So something's important, of course, is that if a language outcome difference is there, but it isn't input-based, then fixing the input won't help. So it's helpful to know if the input on its own is somehow deficient, right, in a way that yields the target knowledge. So that's why I'm focusing here on input and input-based potential delays. So again, that's why it's important to know if the input is at least partially causing the language development issue that we might see or not. It comes back to how do you design, at the end of the day, impactful interventions to help kids. So one thing that we do know is there seem to be input-based delays across socioeconomic status, where lower SES, for socioeconomic status for short, lower SES children are often behind their higher SES peers when it comes to the development of different types of linguistic knowledge. And we know that there are lots of different ways that lower SES input can differ from higher SES input in terms of both the overall quantity of speech or speech types and the quality of that speech sort of measured different ways. So zooming in on quality, there are just lots of different aspects of the input that you can look at, that you can measure. For example, diversity of vocabulary. Maybe when we're talking about their domain of animals, you get kitty and penguin for lower SES, but you get a wider variety of animal names for higher SES speech. Kitty and penguin, but monkey and birdie and puppy and cat and whale and all the rest, right? You can also look at, say, diversity of syntactic constructions at the level of structures, and maybe we get lots of imperatives like go play and come here, and declaratives like I love you and he's nice, but maybe in a more diverse environment in terms of the variety of structures you see, you might get yes no questions like is that a kitty, more WH questions like what would you like to do today, or even tag questions like you like that, don't you, right? Exclamations like what a cutie, right? So just these are another way to measure an aspect of the input that we might think of as the quality of that input. And here's another one: frequency of decontextualized speech, so speech that's not about the here and now, talking about things that aren't there, talking about what's going to happen in the future, right? And maybe you get less of that in, say, lower SES speech versus getting more of that kind of thing in higher SES speech. That turns out to be helpful for developing in certain types of linguistic knowledge. Lots of different ways to measure quality, to zoom in on particular aspects of the input. But the question is, again, how do we tell if any particular input difference, which we can certainly measure, is developmentally meaningful? That is, it's impacting language development as opposed to just being sort of variation that is there but doesn't really matter. And so one standard way is to notice that there's some kind of difference in the input, say, between lower SES and higher SES in some aspect, some way. And then measure the outcomes some sort of language outcome, language knowledge that is observable based on what knowledge you think these kids have in their minds. And then, what you might try to do is see if the input difference you measured correlates with any outcome differences that you found, right? If so, then the input difference might cause the outcome difference, right? This is correlation, not causation, but there's a correlation at least, so maybe the input's causing it, and so it might be developmentally meaningful, but you don't really know. So what I want to talk about today is a new complementary way that uses what I'm calling developmental computational modeling applied to the realm of language development to investigate this question, right? So in particular, a developmental computational model is going to implement a specific language learning theory, right? And in particular, a theory about how children use their input to acquire the knowledge that they use to generate their output, right? It tells you precisely how they go from input to knowledge to output. That is what that theory does. That is what that computational model implements. And so because of this, the learning theory implemented by the model therefore specifies, it tells you as part of the theory, what aspect of the input to be looking at, what aspect of the input matters for developing that language knowledge. And so if we know what input part matters, we can target that part for intervention if needed, right? Great. So, again, just in a nutshell, a developmental computational model can predict the language outcome on the basis of the input, again, because it's implementing a specific learning theory that specifies that. So if the predicted outcomes differ, then it's because the input difference caused that outcome difference. That's how the learning theory works. So the input difference is therefore predicted to be developmentally meaningful because it would cause this predicted outcome difference, right? Of course, any outcome predictions need to be verified, but you can at least say it's potentially developmentally meaningful on the basis of this learning theory implemented in the model. Now, because the learning theory in the model is causal, it says here's how the input causes the knowledge to develop, which we then use to produce the output we see in these kids, right? We can predict on the basis of the learning theory, on the basis of that implemented learning theory in the model, if the input should cause similar outcomes too, in which case the input difference, though there, isn't developmentally meaningful, right? So, really this is about detecting in some sense if input differences are developmentally meaningful. And so, today's focus is going to be on this complementary way that involves developmental computational modeling. And we're going to look at a case study of acquisition of knowledge about syntactic islands. You might be wondering why. And it's because it's higher order syntactic knowledge, that is more complex syntactic knowledge, where it turns out we actually don't know much about developmentally meaningful input differences that may exist across SES, right, in terms of learning the particulars of the syntactic island knowledge for your language.